Hello and welcome to Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. My name is Ben Hauk, and I'm pleased to be able to introduce the 37th installment in our ongoing series. Our September 2025 episode features an interview with Cristina Knopf, who is a professor of communication and media studies at the State University of New York at Cortland. Her conversation with IGS President Lance Strate focuses on her research in comics studies and reflections on the comic book medium, its history, and especially the superhero genre. They also discuss the depiction of superheroes in movies and television, including this past summer's films featuring Superman and the Fantastic Four. Let's hear what they have to say.
Welcome to another episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. I'm here with Cristina Knopf, who is a professor of communication and media studies at the State University of New York at Cortland. Welcome, Christy.
Thank you, Lance. It's a pleasure to be here.
And let me first, since we're audio only, although they may have read it when they looked at it online, but your name is pronounced Knopf.
It is.
Many of us know the publisher with the same spelling, Alfred A. And in fact, I remember Neil Postman was publishing with them, and I always heard it pronounced, I think, Knopf or Knopf.
Yeah. The original German, because Knopf means button, does angrily spit out every single letter for Knopf.
Uh-huh.
I'm not sure why or when my family started kind of anglicizing it as Nope, but that's long enough that nobody really knows what the backstory is on that.
Interesting. I can't help but think of the Parks and Recreation sitcom.
Yes.
Where the lead character is Leslie Knope, but I don't think she spelled it that way. I don't recall offhand if we ever saw her name spelled out.
It is. It's on her desk, I believe, at least at one point, and it's Knope as opposed to my spelling of Knopf. So it's very close.
Yeah, one letter off.
Yes.
And I think for many of our listeners, they think of New York and New York, even New York State in terms of New York City. And then for folks in New York City, would often think of a place like Cortland as upstate, just like the Catskills.
Yes.
I happen to know better since I did my undergraduate work not too far from where you are over in Ithaca at Cornell University, which I think it's like 10 miles away, right? Something like that. Or
I'm not sure what the mileage is, but it's not very far.
Yeah, so it's nestled in there. There's Ithaca, Cortland, and Syracuse is a little further off, but they kind of form a bit of a triangle.
Yes.
And that's better understood as Western New York.
Well, Syracuse is central New York. People from Buffalo would be very offended to think of Ithaca, Cortland, and Syracuse as Western New York.
I stand corrected then. And I remember learning that a lot of that it's actually the northern part of Appalachia.
Yes.
Which again, people don't think of as being connected to New York. You think of it as being more southern.
In fact, I can sit on my deck and look across at the foothills of the Appalachians.
And I remember people talking with a kind of accent that sounded close to a kind of southern accent, with like sort of drawn out vowels and whale and.
Yes, I would agree with that. I'm from the Rochester area, and we tend to be a bit more Midwestern, I think. We even say pop instead of soda. So,
yep. Tell me about so you are from not from Rochester itself, which was a real city. It used to be it was the home of Kodak. I mean, it was pretty much the Kodak city until they went belly up. But where were you from exactly?
I from Canandaigua,
Hmm.
so in the heart of the Finger Lakes. Well, within the Finger Lakes.
Yeah, yeah. And was it a farming community then, or
Very
small
much so,
town?
yes.
Yeah.
In fact, I come from a farming family.
Really?
Yes.
Well, tell me about it. I mean, did you have like cows and
I
chickens?
grew up 2 miles from the farm. The farm was started by my grandfather. It was passed on to my uncle Bernard, my dad's brother, and then it now is being run by his son, my cousin John. So it's a
And
third
what kind of,
generation dairy farm.
so cows.
Yes, a lot of cows and all of the crops to support the cows.
What are those?
Corn for feed, mostly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I have milked a cow once as a counselor at summer camp. I mean, I just will confess to you that
Okay.
I imagine you've done that more than once.
I really didn't. It was all automated and
Oh,
so not so much.
I
I
see.
helped out my dad. My dad still actually helps out on the farm, but he does all the technical stuff now. You'd be surprised at how much of it's now run by computers, which
Well,
is what my dad sort of takes care of.
I see.
Yeah,
So you grew up in Canandaigua
I did.
and went to school there, and then where did you study from there?
I started at Finger Lakes Community College and then transferred to SUNY New Paltz
Mhm.
for my undergraduate degree in public relations and journalism. And then I went to the University at Albany for a master's in political communication and my PhD in sociology and communication.
Okay. And we've had many people coming from, especially from SUNY Albany, and I mean, where we first met, the New York
Hmm.
State Communication Association.
Yes,
There you served as vice president and president,
I did.
uh,
Yes,
also, which we have in common, and as well as being a Wilson Scholar. Um,
yes,
and now you're also serving as an officer in the Media Ecology Association.
I am recording secretary.
Hey, and we're recording right now.
We are recording.
But the part that really interested me and I wanted to talk to you about is that much of, or at least a good part of the scholarship that you've been doing has been had to do with comics.
It has, yes. I've been
And
doing,
how
oh,
far does this go back?
I was just going to say I've been doing comic studies since about 2011.
And how did you get started? Were you reading it like as a kid, or did you come to it later on?
I read some comics as a kid, mostly sort of the Disney titles and things like that that my parents would give me on occasion. Then as teenager and 20s, I started reading a lot of the Simpsons comics because I couldn't get enough Simpsons episodes, so I also read the comics. And I got into comic studies because of my research in war culture, actually. I
Hmm.
was perusing the military history section of a used bookstore up in the Adirondacks, and I found a book from the early 40s called They're All Yours, Uncle Sam, which was a comic book, but more in the style of like a children's picture book sort of thing. It was a hardcover,
Mhm.
but did a humorous look at the entrance of two women into the wax and the waves for World War II, and that got me interested in kind of the depictions of women in the service at that time, and especially the visual ones. And so then I started looking for other comic representations besides just Wonder Woman
Mhm.
for women in the service. And that was actually my first study of comics, was looking at how women were depicted for military service during World War II.
Wow. And of course, it's around that time, really a little bit earlier, that the comic book as a separate medium was introduced. I think it was
Yes.
the early 30s?
Yes.
And they were started by reprinting newspaper
Yep, the first ones
comic.
were collections of the funny strips.
Yeah. And those
Comics
go
were,
back to the late 19th century, the Yellow Kid
yes.
newspapers. For those listening, I'm recounting sort of mass communication 101 history here, but not everyone knows that.
Oh,
And that's actually where the phrase yellow journalism comes in. And the Yellow Kid was part of the innovation of printing color, Sunday color comics.
yes.
So,
And the
go
Yellow
ahead.
Kid, I was gonna say the Yellow Kid also really kind of started some of the idea of transmedia and merchandising that we now associate so strongly with comic books because the Yellow Kid was relaunched into games and toys and songs and theater productions and all kinds of other formats and media. So he arguably was one of the first comic book characters to really get the kind of transmedia treatment that we now so much associate with, the Marvel and DC universes.
Oh, I wasn't aware of that. So that's like the 1890s that's happening?
Yes.
Wow. And so is that considered the origin of comics, or do folks trace it back further?
It really depends on how people want to define comics. There have been various definitions of what constitute a comic, whether it can be a single panel, whether it has to be a sequential aspect. So there's various definitions, some of which would take us back into things like um, hieroglyphics, even tapestries, where we were getting stories told through sequences of pictures.
Right.
So
And
very much depend.
I remember seeing in the wonderful book by Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics, which highly recommend folks as a great introduction to visual communication generally. But he does make note of those kinds of early forms of sequential art. But that would be the basic distinction between, say, the comic form and the cartoon form is the sequential quality of it.
Usually, yes.
So,
Some would argue that you can have a sequence implied in even that single cartoon form. So,
which, from a general semantics point of view, we're talking about an abstract concept. So there's more than one way to sequence it or cut it up or bring it down. Be that as it may, I mean, it does seem that the eight newspaper comic strip is where it really becomes something new.
yes,
And
agreed.
and then for a long time, it was a form and a medium that was disparaged. I'm a bit older than you. Uh, and so for me growing up, this was always, a matter of criticism because I grew up reading comics and I was always being told that this was not a good thing to do. And there may have been some residue from Seduction of the Innocent, which was all about the content of comics as being kind of sexually perverse and all that. But
Violent and yes. And the comics code, the self-censorship
Mhm.
that the industry did in response to that, that raised concerns for Congress, has arguably been pointed to as the reason that comics were disparaged for so long because the post code content was kept sort of so simplified to kind of avoid being controversial that it comics as a form was just looked at as being very juvenile, very immature,
Mm.
and very lacking of kind of any artistic or literary merit because of, in some ways, the comics code and what limits that was being put on.
Yeah, and I'll say that as growing up with it, that was great because the comics of that time were geared toward me. Um, so, I, it was fun to read about Superman just with these stupid stories, with there's always some kind of gimmick or stunt, and of course the campy Batman, um, all of that, and in a way, comics kind of grew up just as I did. Um, but I was thinking, this is sort of following Marshall McLuhan's take media ecology scholarship that because I don't think it was just comics, but that any hybrid medium, that because with literacy in print, specialization was emphasized. So, for example, in music, uh, great music was considered pure music, and adding, as opposed to songs with lyrics, which were a hybrid kind of form, were seen as a lower art form. Uh,
Hmm.
Movies, of course, being the same way, and that comics were seen that way because it's not pure literature because it's pictures, which is children's books with pictures,
Yes.
and it's not pure art because it's simple and simple compared to like painting. So the mixture of different forms made it a lower art form in people's eyes back, coming back as we were emerging from print culture, but it fit in very nicely with television culture where we were used to these hybrid forms.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the interesting thing about the words and pictures combination in print is that, well, one of the other aspects of why comics was sort of that's not a good thing to read was that it wasn't thought to be beneficial for our literacy because, well, we're looking at the pictures, but there's actually a whole other level of literacy that goes into being able to effectively read a comic book because you are taking in both the words and the images. It's not sort of a strict, for Western readership, left to right, top to
Mhm.
bottom engagement that we're doing. We are filling in a lot of gaps as we go. And so we're actually very active audience members when we're reading a comic book. It's not the sort of passive idea of just flipping through and looking at the pictures that people often associated with that medium. And many studies have also indicated that comic books are great gateway for children's literacy and children being able to learn to read.
Mhm. Yeah, well, I often have noted the irony in a way, or the kind of reversal where when I was growing up, it's like you shouldn't read comics, you should read books, and now we're just glad kids will read anything.
True.
And it is a great point that you have to learn how to read, and I guess read in quote marks here, or interpret, properly interpret the comic book images, the art form, because it's not very obvious. Now, I mean, I have to say that, for me, I really gave up on them about 10 years ago, and it just became too expensive.
It has.
Uh, um, but for me, my interest was always in the superhero comics, first DC and then Marvel. So that hasn't been as much of a focus for you.
Focus in what way?
Well,
Or,
interest.
oh yeah, I'm a pretty big Batman fan or Batman universe. I can't
Mhm.
keep up with everything that they publish for Batman because there are so many titles now in for the Bat family and so
Uh-huh.
many crossovers that I can't follow and keep up with everything. But I still do read quite a bit from the Batman universe. My reading tends to kind of go wherever my research is at the moment, so I
Uh-huh.
tend to be spotty, but I do a lot of superhero studies. So,
Okay. Is it Marvel or DC? Which way do you go?
my personal tastes, I think, tend to gravitate more towards DC, but I do scholarship on both sides. I've
Mm.
never Ironically, even though I was never a particularly big Spider-Man fan myself, I've written a lot about Spider-Man. So
Oh,
my reading does tend to jump all over.
Oh, he meant a lot to me growing up because he was from Forest Hills and I grew
Yeah,
up in the next neighborhood over, Kew Gardens. And I think the year they had him graduate college was the same year I graduated college. I just
that's
felt
perfect.
this connection. Um, and I know a lot of people, felt, also just, things like, a lot of people, a lot of kids growing up in my generation would lose their fathers in their youth. A lot of folks passed away too early from cancer and heart attacks, and those kind of stories like Spider-Man kind of,
Hmm.
sort of really resonated for folks since he had lost his parents weren't there to begin with, but that he lost
Hmm.
his uncle at the beginning and all of that. Um, Sort of like
Yes.
Stan Lee was a surrogate father for people.
And family was definitely a big theme of the Marvel comics for that era.
Hmm. And you actually go to these conventions, am I right to understand that?
I do. I have been going to the San Diego Comic Con annually since 2022, I think, whatever year they came back after the COVID shutdown.
Uh,
And I had gone once prior to COVID. But there is a tract that's connected to the San Diego Comic Con called Comic Con for Educators and Librarians. They do programming at the San Diego Library that's just a couple blocks away from the convention center. And anyone in education that's in the area can attend those programs for free without having to have one of the difficult to get and rather expensive badges to be able to access the programming. And then those of us that participate in putting the panels on get all access to the convention for
oh.
the week. So I've been doing that for a number of years.
And can you tell us something about, what it's like at those conventions?
Um,
Your experience has been?
so for me, it's a bit overwhelming. It's a lot of sensory input, but a ton of fun. Lots of crowds and lots of lines. If you've never been to San Diego Comic Con before, you need to, for your first time going, you absolutely need to read up on everybody's tips and tricks because I know the first time I went, I was expecting long lines, but I didn't know that there were all of these sort of rules and regulations for who's allowed in the lines. And so it was difficult to access things the first time that I was there. The nature of it really varies depending on whether or not the studios make an appearance. So the year of the writers and actors strikes when the movies and television streaming shows were not there, um, it was a kind of a lower key energy, but the sessions that normally would have been somewhat empty were packed. People were actually more focused on the comics
Yeah.
without the studios there. And this year was another one where the big studios were not there for some reason. And there's a lot more activity on the exhibit floor. I know the year with the strikes, the artists that were exhibiting actually did much more business than they normally do because people weren't waiting in line to get into the big Hall H programming to see the celebrities. But it's it's total fan culture, so it's not just the comics. You get all kinds of genre or geek uh, fiction represented there. Uh, it is a lot of people. For the most part, it's a really positive vibe. I actually overheard someone shuffling along in the crowds this year talking about the fact that you get out of the convention grounds and you get back into our social media feeds and our news updates and all of the ugliness and divisiveness in the world, but that while people were in the convention, everybody was just sort of friendly and everyone was like, oh, hey, you're a fan, I'm a fan. It doesn't matter what we're fans of. We're here to celebrate that. And so there tends to be this kind of congeniality that permeates.
Sounds lovely. And there's a lot of cosplay, as they say, people dressing up.
There is a lot of cosplay. Yes. I am often one of the cosplayers. I decided to just dress as a geek this year and didn't do any costumes, but the masquerade, which is the big kind of professional grade uh, cosplay show, is always a major event every year. And then there's just a lot of people that show up in various levels of costuming from these really, really elaborate things. And you can tell that they are there simply to show off their artistic creation because they can't move much, they can't see much, but they sort of stand in different places and are there for the photo ops. And then people that kind of have maybe like partial costumes just to celebrate their fandom as they go around.
And what have you dressed up as in the past?
I've done some usually DC characters, Zatanna, the magician from the DC universe, as well as Madame Xanadu, the fortune teller from the DC universe. Both of those are characters from Justice League Dark. Um, I haven't done it at San Diego, but I've cosplayed as the Scarecrow, which is my favorite comic book character of all time.
The Batman villain?
The Batman villain, yes, because there is a Marvel villain called the Scarecrow as well, but just not quite as well known.
Be a little challenging to quite copyright that.
Yeah.
So aside from superheroes, I mean, what have you been studying in this medium? I mean, we'll go back to the superheroes, but in terms of your own scholarship and research.
My first book was a look at cartoons and comics created by military personnel,
Mhm.
and sort of what the about military personnel about military service.
Yeah,
Because of course there are a lot of veteran creators for Marvel and DC, people that served in World War II in particular. But
which was pretty commonplace for the men
yes,
that generation.
yes.
And what did
Uh,
you find then?
that
You could sum it
the
up.
Yeah, really that the military experience tends to be one that is fairly universal, whether somebody was serving in the American Civil War or was a German troop in World War II, that there are a lot of things that are just really common to that military experience. Uh, Bad leadership, bad food, and
Yeah.
a lot of camaraderie.
And World War II, of course, was the heyday. I mean, I don't think they ever got back to that as far as sales for comics. And that they were extremely popular with the servicemen during that period.
They were, yes. Uh, That was, of course, the golden age of comics. The comic book industry, like the rest of the entertainment industry, was very involved in the war effort in different ways. You had Batman and Superman kind of hawking war bonds on the covers, uh, but also they were absolutely a very popular reading material for the service personnel, partly because they were so portable,
Mhm.
easy to mail, easy to receive, easy to share. And so they were very popular media at that point. Yeah.
And apart from that genre, have there been other uh, genres in comics that you've written about?
My second book focused on the way that politics, in that sort of presidential, congressional campaign sense of the word, so the things that we recognized as being political, and not just political in terms of issues or messages, but actual government campaign kinds of things, and how politics proper have appeared in comic books. So how we've represented presidents, how we've represented Congress, how campaigns, elections, social movements have been reflected in the comic book medium. And this shows up in different ways. There's sort of the nonfiction biographical comics that have been published. Um, camp
I,
Harry S. Truman had an actual campaign comic book that was used, but also we get it through the superhero things. Batman was president for a while.
so was Lex Luthor.
Lex Luthor was president for a while.
Some
Loki
consider
ran for
pathetic.
president.
One of my first comic books, and this was I sometimes joke I was reading comic books before I could read, and I remember my mother commenting about how happy she was when I learned how to read, so she wouldn't have to read them to me anymore. But I'm one of my first ones, and it came out after the Kennedy assassination, and they said they had delayed it because of that. But it was a story because John F. Kennedy had a campaign for physical fitness.
Yes, John F.
And
Kennedy and Superman.
yeah, yeah, he recruits Superman to help with that. And that was, I think, um, my first Superman comic, and maybe the first one that I bought, or I didn't buy. I was always nagging, you know,
Sure.
you know. It actually on the cover, it wasn't the cover story. The cover story had Lex Luthor somehow becoming Superman's father on Krypton. I guess that changes over time because early on it was a lot of positive images of the government, and that shifted.
Yes, for the most part. I'd say positive connected maybe more to the presidency.
Mhm.
Congress was always a little, I think, more of a shady organization in the comics. And I sort of think this is related to the comics code and the congressional hearings that kind of led to that. I think it was a way for creators to kind of take a jab back at
Yeah,
Congress after that was implemented. The president for a long time was, I think, very positively presented, but of course, superheroes for a long time were also much more, I think, aligned with the government upholding truth, justice, and the American way.
yeah,
And so when they were there, it was usually as kind of the icon of those ideals. Caveats to that would be times when supervillains stepped into the presidency to be taken down, of course. This could be through doppelgangers,
Mhm.
we've kidnapped the president and put in our
Yeah.
man type of thing, or through things like Lex Luthor, Victor Von Doom being president and kind of the authoritarian
Yeah,
elements of those governments that then the superheroes would be in opposition to. And that usually created some tension in the stories as well, because superheroes are supposed to be on the side of law and order. And if the president is the head of law and order, then now what do we do? So, well, mostly positive, especially with things like Superman and Kennedy. Kennedy even helped out Superman in one issue, helping to make it so that both Clark Kent and Superman could be seen in the same place. Kennedy helped him out with that. Um, but there have been moments where we've kind of acknowledged that just because someone is the president or is a congressional representative does not necessarily mean they're the good guy.
yeah. That's interesting you bring that up because some of the kind of early on there was some criticism, coming even from folks who I would otherwise like what they have to say, like McLuhan, Walter on, where they just sort of disparage the superheroes as authoritarian. And then, a little later on, coming from the kind of left or Marxist criticism that they're basically stand-ins for the government or for policing. And again, growing up, I mean, they always had this sort of like semi-official status that, that Batman, Superman were, um, somehow deputized,
Mhm.
members of the police or something like that. Whereas Spider-Man, of course, was not. He was always on the outs.
And Batman, it's depended on sort of which version of the character. I think, the Adam West series definitely,
Um,
aligned him because he and Commissioner Gordon, had the phone back and forth. But if you think about Batman's character being the figure that's trying to sort of root out the police corruption, then we get more of that vigilante outside of the police
Right.
sort of thing that we often see associated with Spider-Man.
Mhm. And I would imagine that just, there is a longstanding thing of like the bad senator. And they often give like more power to an individual senator than would
Yes.
actually be there, that they can somehow persecute people or whatever. But, I imagine that after Watergate, we would see some of those shifts in the general depiction of the government, including the president. Is that the case?
Yes. In fact, I think one of the sort of earliest, well, maybe not earliest, but one of the clearest sort of post-Watergate things of this was DC Comics. It put out the series Prez, which was very short-lived,
I remember.
focusing on America's first teenage president. When the voting age was lowered, they kind of envisioned this idea that it would also change ultimately the age of eligibility for the presidency, that the youth vote would kind of
Mhm.
usher in broader changes. And so we end up with Prez, which is his actual name because his mother decided when he was born that he was going to be president. Uh, and we see this very much in the four short issues that were done before it got briefly rebooted about 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, um,
Yeah.
by Mark Russell. But
Well, yeah.
Prez takes sort of, it's dedicated to, again, rooting out corruption and seeing kind of the government as it was, as broken. Um, but there's also a little bit of pushback in this comic of kind of that adult skepticism of the youth movement of the 70s, and Prez doesn't do a very good job and is a bit incompetent at
Yeah.
doing that. So,
Which after all, they were written by members of, either the greatest generation, as they've come to be
yeah,
called, or the silent generation, and
yes.
not so much the baby boomers themselves. I also made that makes me think of, there was a Roger Corman movie from around that time, Wild in the Streets, that imagined, a hippie kind of president who's, kind of makes literal the old saying, don't trust anyone over 30. So we were talking about your two books, and you didn't mention the titles, which is, and you said you had some education in PR, but it seems like maybe that was a little lacking. So why don't you tell us the titles of those books?
The first is The Comic Art of War, and the second is Politics in the Gutters.
Okay. And has there been other research on comics after those two, or in
Uh,
between, or?
Yeah, I have a number of chapters in anthologies on comics. So I've looked at a number of different things in loosely related areas. One of the most recent ones that actually just came out a couple weeks ago, if I can remember the name of the book, it's a chapter in a book called Women Vigilantes and Outlaws in American Popular Media. and I discuss the character of Lady Luck, who was one of the newspaper strips from what was called the Eisner section of the
Mm.
newspaper, which had
Oh,
the spirit or the spirit section of the newspaper, which had the spirit as well as some other rotating
mhm.
stories from the Eisner studio that
From
were credited. Yeah,
Will
Will
Eisner.
Eisner.
Yeah, the spirit was fantastic.
Yeah.
Uh,
And characters like Lady Luck, he would be credited as creating, though whether or not he did was a little bit more dubious. But
mhm.
those strips were coming out of his studio, and my chapter looks at this character who was a vigilante herself, kind of in the Bruce Wayne or Zorro sensibility of being a well-to-do but very bored socialite who set out to kind of unmask crime.
Mhm. Well, there's so much we could continue to talk about this, but and you brought up the movies and TV, and I did want to get to that, and especially, I mean, this summer we saw two major entries, one from the DC camp and one from Marvel. With DC we had Superman, which is essentially, I mean, we kind of reboot the DC universe in movies.
Yes. DC, I think, has struggled to find its footing in the cinematic area. I think it's now starting to come into its own, but for a long
Yeah.
time it was sort of understood that Marvel produced better movies and DC produced better animated work.
Mhm. Yeah. So we have a new Superman movie.
We do.
And I assume you saw that movie.
I did see it, yes. I saw
And
it with
so,
a group of other comic studies scholars, well, during the Comic Studies Society conference this summer.
wow. So I'm curious as to your thoughts because it certainly was successful, relatively speaking, and uh, much talked about. So,
I thoroughly enjoyed it.
mhm.
Uh, I thought it hit the notes that it was purportedly intended to hit of being a film that was sort of optimistic and feel good. Uh, and I was just personally really excited about the inclusion of Crypto the Superdog in
Mhm.
this version of Superman. That's
Did it
something that
bother you? Did it bother you at all that he didn't look quite like Crypto in the comics?
Um, no, because nobody ever looks quite like they do in the comics.
Hmm.
So I'm okay with that.
There's a
We had
kind of
we had a Superman whose costume was sort of an amalgamation of different comic book iterations of the costume. So I think to have a Crypto that looked a little bit
baggy.
unique was good. Yes. I thought the storyline kind of held together. I thought it caught the spirit of a number of different sort of key features of the Superman character. I was personally kind of interested to see how they were going to manage the idea of journalism and a newspaper
Hmm.
in 2025 when
Uh-huh.
journalism journalists aren't as respected of a profession as they may have once been, and newspapers are a dying art. So I thought that was kind of well done. They didn't ignore that, but they still managed to make the Daily Planet part of the storyline.
Mhm.
Um, I thought the acting portrayal of Superman and Clark Kent was quite good. I kind of got hints of Christopher Reeve's portrayal in there because Reeve was really good at being able to kind of change his demeanor and body language, not just pull the glasses on and off, but to kind of
Mhm.
embody a different type of character depending on whether he was Clark or whether he was Superman. And I felt that that was also kind of there. And there were moments when I almost got the impression that, we were looking at this sort of almost like reincarnation of Christopher Reeves, especially in the Clark Kent moments. So I really enjoyed it. I know that the movie was controversial for its purported political content, particularly in relation to the portrayal of Lex Luthor as being a tech bro kind of character. Politics aside, I thought the storyline of Superman versus Lex Luthor was pretty on the mark for what those two characters have always represented.
Yeah, yeah. And I think arguably Christopher Reeves sort of defined the sort of cinematic approach to Superman. Of course, for me, uh, growing up, it was the TV program that was Superman, but I have very fond memories of when this is 78, I think the movie version,
Mm-hmm.
and you'll believe a man can
A
fly
man can fly.
was the tagline.
Yep.
Although it was a bit exaggerated the way he did it, and then the script kind of violated a lot of what what the boundaries of what Superman would or could do.
Yes.
Um, but especially Superman 2, where he gives up his powers. I mean, it just, yeah, was
Yeah, the
not true
sequels
to
get
the
a little
character.
complicated, but yeah.
Yeah. But it was hard to get out of the shadow of Christopher Reeves. And now, what did you think then compared to the previous iteration of Superman and of the DC universe,
Well,
the
yeah,
darker.
I'll admit I'm behind on some of the serial, the televised or streaming iterations of the character. But for the cinema, for me, this was just a much more memorable depiction of the story. I think in some ways by not starting with once again who Superman is and how he got to Earth, and even though all that more or less got revealed throughout the story, by not making his origin the focus of the movie, we got
Oh, yeah,
a much stronger kind of good versus not good plot line. We got
right.
to have a team up. We got a lot more stuff going on. We came in on Clark and Lois's relationship instead of starting with the beginnings of the relationship and Clark getting shot down by Lois. We didn't have to see the same storyline all over again, so I thought
Yeah.
this was a bit more memorable.
I'll say that's one of my pet peeves is that if you know the comics, then the origin story is the least interesting thing. And quite often they don't even bother with it when they start out. And when they do, it's like a very quick kind of thing because that's not at all what's interesting about the character or the storyline. So the fact that these movies, and that's that linear thing of, well, we have to tell a story beginning, middle, and end, but comics are quite the opposite. They're more like the soap opera, never-ending story.
And you can come into a comic book brand new, and there's usually a little blurb at the very beginning that gives you just enough to know where you're coming in on, but you don't need to have the origin as the beginning point every time. Yeah.
But again, I mean, I was asking about the previous version of Superman, which was a much darker portrayal, where he's almost threatening in some ways.
Yes. And As
and
far as the
Batman, and there's like they had Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, and then the Justice
yeah,
League, and
um, I have no kind of problem with the darker versions. I just thought that this one brought out a spirit of the character that we haven't seen for a while. Uh,
yeah.
for a long time, Superman was sort of disregarded or brushed aside even by fans as being like, oh, well, he's boring because he's just a Boy Scout, so he's not interesting. People
Mhm.
found that the not dark character didn't have depth. And I think this time we can see you can have depth, you can have conflict, you can have internal struggles without having to kind of go dark and stay dark.
Mhm.
And so I liked that aspect.
Yeah, in a way, it's very refreshing, especially living in dark times in reality.
It is, and I saw a few interview segments with James Gunn, the director, on kind of the idea that that's what he wanted for this movie was for it to be something that offered some lightness and some optimism and some escape for people because we do have so much darkness and conflict in our daily lives right now.
Yeah, and some hope.
Yes.
It's now, I mean, the movie also, they didn't have the Justice League, but they had the Justice Gang, which
Yeah.
I don't recall ever hearing that idea before.
I I don't believe that has been used before. I think that was sort of a unique phrase for the movie.
Yeah. And with several characters who are like not the usual suspects.
Yes, we had Mr. Terrific. Right? No, yeah,
Yeah.
Mr. Terrific, and Hawk Girl, Hawk Woman in there,
Mhm.
which was great. I'm a big fan of Hawk Woman from the DC animated
Mhm.
universe from the 90s.
Uh-huh.
So I was excited by that one. Yeah.
Yeah,
And I
there's
think that that was a nice touch. Like, not only did you get the team up happening so that it wasn't just Superman beating up the
mhm.
bad guys, you did have that teamwork aspect, which I think also kind of keeps it from being a darker story. Uh,
Mhm.
but you also that way got more kind of variety in the superhero. And I know again, we get a lot of controversy and toxic fandom around issues of representation in these characters. But by having a team up of pre-existing characters that still let us bring in not just the heroic white male, but also a black man, a woman. We got a representation in ways that I think were going to be authentic enough to the original comics to not upset people right out of the gate, while
Uh-huh.
still offering a story that wasn't just another heroic white man story.
Yeah. Well, in terms of representation, and Mr. Terrific is probably the least well-known character, and is actually a was a newer version of a Golden Age character, but one that was re-envisioned as an
Hmm.
African American character, from Earth 2 originally, right? And the kind of like the newer Justice Society hero, but so it's just surprising to have him injected into into that storyline.
I mean, I had been used to sort of seeing a version of the character in Arrow,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah,
But
yeah,
to have it brought into Superman was with a very different tone to it, because of course Arrow was another very dark and brooding
yeah.
superhero story.
Which was that was a TV series for folks who are unfamiliar with
Yes.
that, on the CW, and that was the first of several um, DC series that were kind of much lower budget, being TV and series, but But yeah, I mean, it was sort of a struggle for all of these folks, all of these companies to, with such a legacy going back to the mid 20th century to find diverse characters, especially racially diverse characters to bring into
Yeah.
uh, play. And previously, and you mentioned the animated universe from the 90s, they had a character Cyborg who was a young African American. I
Yes.
always felt like kind of uncomfortable about that because it's like when you combine things. So he's African American, but he's also someone who is kind of disabled in a way, which is why he's a cyborg. He's like more machine than human, and all of that. Whereas Mr. Terrific is a very positive kind
Yes.
of character, as not only just being whole, but also being someone who's um, uh, kind of smart rather than physical, the way so many of these characters are.
Yeah. That it's always an issue when we're bringing in really any identity that's not a straight white male into these characters for the depictions, because as soon as you start talking about superhuman abilities, that kind of borders up with non-human characteristics. And so then when you start combining it with identities that have been historically dehumanized in different ways, depictions can become very tricky, even when they're not intended to be um, stereotypes or other forms of kind of dehumanization. And so by having this version as just someone who is kind of only superhuman in their intelligence and their tech savvy, effectively gives us a non-white superhero that doesn't create some of the complications that have historically been embedded in these efforts.
Now, you didn't mention the third person of the Justice Gang, which was an unusual
Yeah,
Green Lantern, as
Green Lantern.
there
Yeah.
are more than one.
There's an
And
entire core.
yeah, and in fact, there is an African American Green Lantern along with the
Yes.
original Silver Age white male character. But in this case, we have Guy Gardner, who was sort of originally just a sort of substitute, but turned into a kind of comic, like a jerk. Uh,
Yeah.
to make fun of in a lot of ways in I think during the 80s. And they bring in that character, although not as severe as he was depicted in the comics, but that seemed an unusual choice too.
Um, yeah, when I initially heard that that was the Green Lantern that they were going to be using, I was a little disappointed because I do like John Stewart, which is the African American Green Lantern, as well as some other versions of the character. But I think by bringing Guy Gardner in, that's one of the ways that they did make this a more lighthearted, more optimistic story because we get that comedic relief in there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, and one scene that I thought was just brilliant was the one where, Superman or Clark Kent and Lois are talking in the apartment, and you see past them through the window the Justice Gang fighting a villain, and and it's just like going on, and it's like they're where the Superman and Lois are just completely ignoring it, but it's just going on and on in the background.
Yeah, I liked that too because we have these universes that are populated by multiple superheroes.
Mhm.
And yet, whenever we focus on a story of one of them, it's like all of the other ones just sort of cease to exist. And so this time, that didn't happen. We had other superhumans fighting battles that Superman just wasn't needed for, at least until they had their ultimate team up. But
Yeah.
I liked the fact that they were able to bring in these sort of different story worlds that always overlap hypothetically
Mhm.
into conversation with each other in a way that worked so that you did actually have more than just Superman defending Metropolis, but he was the go-to for certain threats. And then when needed, they could work together. And I thought that was effectively done.
And that's one of the great creations of the comic book medium was the universe in a way. I mean, unless you're, someone who's an absolute genius like Tolkien and can create it all on your own. And don't get me started with Game of Thrones, which is just really does not have anywhere near the quality of Tolkien's Middle Earth, and but I mean, with the comics, we had this sort of collaborative universe kind of coming together organically with the DC comics. And that was something I think that people really loved. And then you turn, we move into the early 60s and we have Stan Lee working with Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko and deliberately creating the universe, still forming organically, but but with more intentionality, which leads us to the other big movie, the Fantastic Four. And that's been done twice before, and both versions were really not very good at all, and certainly big failures. So were you able to see the Fantastic Four movie?
I was able to, yes. I actually saw that in Ithaca, your college town. Yes.
Ooh. And what were your reactions to that one?
Um, I liked it a lot. I was very initially just very excited by the setting for the fact that they were putting it in the 60s and taking it back to that as opposed to giving us a superhero team that once again created in a different decade, but now it's just magically updated. I like the fact that they kind of took it back to its roots. And again, we had another superhero movie that decided to skip the origin story.
Right, right.
With the earlier versions of the movies, I'm trying to remember when the first one, well, we had what the one was in the mid 90s, 94, I think they did the movie, and
They're
then the
following on
more,
the X-Men, I think.
yeah, and then
And they had a sequel, and then
they did the Rise of the
and
Silver Surfer,
right, and then they did a
and
reboot as
in 2015, so about 10 years ago.
mhm.
Um, both of those did the origin story. They did the origin story a bit differently in each one.
Yeah.
But here again, we skipped over the origin story and we come in, the team has its powers. We do find out through the course of the narrative how they ended up having their superpowers, but that
Mhm.
wasn't the focus of the movie, which meant that we got, you know, actual plot lines of again kind of good versus evil. And one thing that I thought this film version emphasized a bit more than the previous two efforts was the idea of the Fantastic Four family dynamic, because that was
Yeah.
such a key part to uh, Lee and Kirby's idea behind the team was that it wasn't just a superhero team, but that it is a family. So you
Mhm.
have Mr. Fantastic, who is married to the Invisible Woman, who's the sister to the Human Torch, and then Thing is Mr. Fantastic's like best friend from school. And so
Right.
you have an actual family, and a lot of the Fantastic Four comics were kind of dealing with what does it mean to be a family under these circumstances. And well, I think the earlier two movies kind of hit the edges of that.
Mhm.
They went more for the dysfunctional family. I mean, all families are dysfunctional, but they kind of focused on the infighting, I think, a bit more than just the negotiating these family issues and conflicts that I think this story did a much better job of.
Yeah, and they also, I think, really highlighted them as celebrities, which they were in the comics, to the extent
Yes,
that they didn't
yes.
have secret identities. Everyone knew who they were,
Yeah.
and they were much admired.
And then the fact that they use that celebrity to kind of do a tip of the hat to those of us long-term fans by kind of bringing in some of the things that we would remember from our childhood. For me, I grew up, Fantastic Four was basically reruns of the 1967 cartoon series. That was my introduction.
I remember that fondly.
Yeah. And so by having kind of these moments of seeing the characters depicted as cartoons in the movie,
Yes, that was
you
so
know,
funny.
yeah, you get those. It's like, yeah, that's the team that I grew up with. Yes.
Yeah, that they're watching themselves as cartoons,
Yes.
and they're even like in the comics, back in that early period where they would make reference to themselves being depicted as in the comics,
Hmm.
and even taking issue with that depiction. Um, yeah, and that retro look, I mean, for me, it was so nostalgic to see New York, New York City, that, although it had some of this futuristic stuff, because this is an alternate reality
Yes.
thing, but it was New York of the 60s that they were showing us. I know it just gave me, it's such a thrill. Uh, I, Also, I mean, really lovely was all of the way in which it was not about, I mean, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I mean, so much of it was this, like until he passed away, always sneaking a Stan Lee cameo and all of that. Here it was all about Jack Kirby. Um, and Kirby was the artist who did much of of what they were of that early Marvel universe. And I some people argue that he was the one who was the real creative power, and that Stan Lee took a lot of the credit for what Jack Kirby actually
Hmm.
created.
Yeah, I think by putting more focus on the visual elements for this,
Mhm.
by making that 60s aesthetic, by really emphasizing the blue of their uniforms and kind of making blue a recurring color scheme throughout the movie, it does give the artist more attention. And this is an issue, bringing it back to sort of researching these topics. This is an ongoing tension within comic studies as well. We often, as scholars, have a tendency to default to the textual in things, especially because a lot of comic scholarships comes from uh, English, people that are doing composition and literature. And so much of our attention ends up focusing on the story and too often neglecting kind of what role the visuals are playing in that. And so that's one thing I really appreciated about the films making the most of the visuals in the way that it did, was putting the emphasis back onto the art in the comics and not just the storyline.
That's so true. But on top of that, some of what I've seen is that Kirby actually did a lot of the scripting. I mean, he did the plotting,
Mm,
a lot of the
true.
scripting, and then Stan Lee took credit as the writer, and that the changes that he did made were often bad changes, rather, made it worse rather than better.
Yeah.
Uh, so I have to ask, though, because you've taken some feminist approaches to some of this analysis, and the one of the big changes has been the Silver Surfer, who's introduced in this film, and uh, the identity shifts from a male character to a female character. And the other one is the portrayal of Susan Storm, as both wife and mother, who especially when Stan Lee was scripting, was often shown in a very negative light. It's just like kind of the helpless female uh, kind of character, even though she had her own powers. And
Yes. Um, I've got more to say on Sue, so I'll start off by commenting on
Sure.
the gender for the Silver Surfer. Uh, I know that took a bit of heat in, sort of fans that felt that it wasn't being true to the original. Uh, Considering the nature of the character, I think it worked really well for developing the main character's kind of backstory. The Human Torch, Johnny, is always depicted as kind of a daredevil and thinks of himself as a real ladies' man. And so, by having the Silver Surfer be a female, that gets brought out in his interactions with her, as opposed to
Uh-huh.
having him doing his usual kind of hitting on all of the women, which we got with the version of the character in the 90s movies. And
Mhm.
so I think they were able to establish that trait in a way that was a bit more low key by simply having him kind of pursuing this one female figure, literally, uh, in the show. Um, it also, I think, did play on gender typing a little bit to change that gender, because the Surfer, the Herald for Galactus, does that role in either form as a, a way to protect their home world and their loved ones. I think by making this a female, it brings out the maternal
Mhm.
element of protection, which is then echoed by what's going on in the larger plot with Sue and the Fantastic Four trying to protect their child from Galactus throughout. So I think changing that helps the storyline for this one, this limited movie a bit more. They were able to do more with it because they could develop two characters, two aspects of the storyline in relationship to making the Surfer a female figure instead of the male character. Uh, Sue Storm as a mother, that is definitely a key component in her comic book depictions as well, but we have not seen it before in the movies. One thing I thought was really kind of interesting was the fact that they didn't just depict her as a mother, but they depicted her as pregnant in
Yeah.
the film. I think it's Jeffrey Brown has written about the aspect of motherhood in relation to the superhero genre, that we're talking about characters that wear spandex, about characters that are these like sleek, muscular, uh, physical ideals of the form. And the
Mhm.
pregnant body defies that. It,
Yeah.
it kind of expands beyond the limits of the spandex. And so to show her as pregnant was a very bold kind of move for the movie in terms of taking the characters beyond the old gender stereotypes. Motherhood in the superhero genre has often been complicated for a number of reasons. One thing is, as we saw in this film, being a mother kind of creates a different level of vulnerability. This brings up all the issues that have always been connected to women in public life. Can they do both roles? Can you be an effective leader if you're also taking care of your child? And they deal with that in
Mhm.
this, that Sue grapples with both taking care of her child, but also taking care of her city and her world, and manages to do both just fine and dandy, bringing us to the second wave idea of the supermom, the woman that has it all.
Uh,
Yeah. uh, so yeah, I think they really gave us something that's been occurring with varying degrees of success over the years in the comics, in the movies for kind of the first time. And I appreciated that element of it a lot. Um, I've been in anticipation of our discussion today. I was watching some of the cartoons from '67, as well as the reboot they did in '94, and that is a very different Sue Storm. She is perfectly capable, but she's kind of depicted as the typical blonde who often forgets that she's perfectly capable until Mr. Fantastic, her husband, reminds her, like, you can use your power here. And then
Yeah.
she can get out of it. In the comics now, Sue's actually the leader of the team. And
Well,
so,
that's what we see in the movie pretty much. I mean, it's
yes,
not said formally, but she pretty much takes the leadership role. She's also shown as arguably the most powerful member of the team, uh, which, that traditionally was the thing, Benjamin
yeah,
Grimm was the powerhouse, but it was certainly surprising and interesting that Mr. Fantastic, or I mean, they hardly ever use a superhero name, which is
yeah,
always was always one of the nice touches. Is Reed Richards, whose real superpower was his just being the smartest man, smartest person in the world. And the great scientist, but that his superpower is, technically is stretching, the ability to stretch, and they show almost none of that in the movie.
yeah.
I thought that was very interesting to really downplay that aspect of him.
Yeah, I haven't really looked into it. I noted the same thing. I was wondering if it has to do with keeping a sense of realism in the depictions, that somehow that stretching just always looks ridiculous. Even
Uh-huh.
in the cartoons, it doesn't always work that well. So whether they thought that by not having him do a lot of extensive, bizarre stretching in this would make it seem a bit more realistic
Mhm.
for the characters, whether it had to do with just what was going to work and not in terms of the CG, um, or whether they were trying to just put more emphasis on his intelligence and the abilities of Sue in this.
Mhm. Yeah. When you talk about representation, I can't help but notice one thing that's missing. Um, and it's just like this kind of strange dynamic that, I've lived with all my life because, we went from uh, it being pretty much white, male, WASP, Protestant characters, usually male, but sometimes female, into this, the more diverse kind of selection. And in the comics, they at least open up a bit to it where they eventually have the Thing, Benjamin Grimm, to be Jewish. They
Hmm.
identify him as being Jewish. And of course, in this story, that's not the case. But I mean, the whole thing, like Yancey Street, is Delancey Street in
Yeah.
the Lower East Side, which was, for a long time a Jewish neighborhood. We go back to Stan Lee and Jack Kirby were both Jewish fellows who, injected a lot of that into their characters. Early on, Spider-Man was sort of called Woody Allen, uh, turned into a superhero because it was all about his neuroses and insecurity. And even further back to uh, the creators of Superman, the two teenage Jewish boys, and that view that it represented the immigrant experience where Clark Kent being bumbling is the immigrant who's trying to pass as an
Hmm.
American, and Superman is the person showing who he really is, coming from the old country, which of course explodes in the same way that having to run away from persecution, is their old home kind of exploding, even to the Kryptonian name of Superman, Kal-El, which El is a Hebrew morpheme, a Hebrew word that stands for God, and that name could be, I mean, depending on what word you say, Kal or Kol, and it could be voice of God or all God, or a lot of those interpretations, which didn't didn't surface, or people didn't start writing about it, I think, until the 80s. Um, so, for me, that's something that still is missing, and that when it comes up, it's all too often negative these days, where like Magneto originally was not characterized as Jewish, but when we get to the later
The movies.
comics and the movies, he's a Holocaust survivor turned into a villain. Uh,
Hmm.
so it's just, I think we all look for the positive representatives from, whatever our identities are. And, I just can't help to notice that missing element, in these films.
They did hint at Ben's, background, I think, a little
Mhm.
bit. Of course,
Yeah.
when he's the children are asking him to throw the car. I'm
Uh,
pretty sure that was the courtyard for a synagogue, if I recall. I think there was a Star of David on that, so they kind of hint at it in
yeah.
this, but maybe future movies they will bring that out more.
Yeah.
Yeah, but definitely has been a big part of his character in the comics. Yeah.
We do have some interesting mixes, nonetheless. And it's, going back to casting, I mean, Pedro Pascal as Reed Richards, who, I mean, to me, that was the ultimate, white bread wasp character. And that seems appropriate, I mean, that is, it's a traditional kind of character. So
Hmm.
you know, why move away from that? Because you know, that's a type of person that is very, if no longer the majority in American society, is certainly an important historically, and a very significant part of the population.
We get that idea, I think, more with Sue. We still have the white skin, blonde haired
Mhm.
depiction
It
there.
was interesting in the first major adaptation. It was Jessica Alba. I remember there was a
Yes.
bit of questioning about, whether she could play that character, as, again, a blonde, blonde haired, blue eyed kind of character.
And they don't really make her that blonde in those movies. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Um, but in those movies, they really played her for, they wanted to always make it like somehow that her invisibility wound up with her being naked, and
Yeah.
visible at some
Yeah,
point.
they really went for some of the gags that we saw back in the 40s with the Invisible Woman. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. Is there other material, either from the current movie scape or on TV? Certainly a lot of stuff on Disney doing Marvel, and I guess it's now HBO Max doing DC. Anything that you're particularly fond of or take note of?
I have really gotten into Invincible on Amazon Prime,
Oh, yeah.
which is an animated
Hmm.
superhero based on comics of the same name. And that franchise has quite a fandom as well. It's another one that I think really spends a lot more time considering family dynamics connected to these stories. It's also one that I think manages to kind of probe at the dark turn in superhero stories that we can trace back to the 80s with The Dark Knight and The Watchmen, kind of
Hmm.
changing the nature from the Boy Scout of Superman to these heroes that are a bit more morally ambiguous and not always doing
Yeah.
good, even when they're trying to do good. They also manage to do a lot of harm, and those issues certainly started coming out more and more, taking us back to the discussion about the darker versions of these characters versus like this
Yeah.
Superman. And I
Yeah.
think Invincible kind of tries to toe the line between those two things. It demonstrates that not all superheroes are always doing good, but that some of them are really trying to, and that moral ambiguity is something that's not maybe inherent to the superhero figure, but inherent to human nature, and kind of the fact that we all do the best with what we've got at the moment, and after the fact we might not have made the same choices or handled things the same way, but we did what we could with the knowledge and the abilities and the bandwidth that we had at the moment. And I think it tries to get at some of those issues more. It also does, as a production value, does some really interesting things with its soundtrack, which I love.
Well, that's a great note, I mean, that you bring in here, because it really comes down to, do we need heroes or are we better off without them? I mean, there was a line of thinking that, especially from a democratic point of view, that it may be harmful to hold anyone up as a hero. But what's your view on that?
Well, this is sort of what Lex Luthor, when you get beyond like the tech bro component of the latest version of him, this is one of the things that Lex Luthor always had against Superman. Besides his own innate jealousy of Superman's abilities, was his fear that we were going to kind of be too dependent on the hero figure, that it should be the people that were fighting for themselves, not depending on someone else to swoop in and save them. Um, for me, superhero stories are kind of these inspirational ideas, that there are these moments of being able to say, like, there is still hope, like with the Superman movie, but not necessarily in looking for someone else to come in and do it, but in that way that the hero in these movies, especially in something like Superman, really depends on other people stepping up and helping out. We get heroes in Superman of non-superpowered people that put their lives down so that Superman can save others. And so I think we need the hope that the heroes embody.
Well, I think that's a great note to end on, and I will say that, to just bring a little more general semantics to bear on it, that, from going back to Korzybski, and the origin of it was its belief in progress and that we can be better. We can make ourselves into better versions, and, can look to ideals, and aspire to them in order to improve upon ourselves.
And that was the message in Fantastic Four, that strive for improving society and doing it together. Yeah.
That's the only way to do it.
Yeah.
Cristina Knopf, thank you so much. This has been a
Thank
great
you, Lance.
conversation.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the September 2025 episode of Semantic Reactions, featuring Dr. Cristina Knopf. If you like what you've heard, or even if you haven't, please consider becoming a member of the Institute of General Semantics if you're not one already. In addition to supporting our efforts, IGS members receive an annual subscription to our journal, etc., a review of general semantics, access to our online and in-person events, lectures, and seminars, and discounts on the books and audiovisual materials that we sell. Regular membership is only $50 and half off for students. Your membership and any additional donations you care to make will help to support our offerings and activities as we work to bring a measure of sanity to the world. The Institute of General Semantics is a 501c3 nonprofit organization dedicated to research and education on a wide range of topics. They include language and symbols, meaning and perception, communication and representation, media and technology, science and epistemology, creativity, and critical thinking. We are dedicated to making the world a better place through practical strategies for improving our semantic environment, individually and collectively. For more information about the Institute and our activities, and to become a member and supporter of our work, please visit our website at generalsemantics.org. That's generalsemantics, one word, .org. And this brings to a close our 37th episode of Semantic Reactions, the official podcast of the Institute of General Semantics. This is Ben Houck, signing off, saying, we hope you'll join us next time. And until then, just remember this simple fact. that the map is not the territory.